Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. And yeah, thank you so much, Elena, and to the project. And as Dr. Nyanto said, it's such a joy to be part of this project and to represent the Tanzanian perspective from this side of the project. And it's been um, really enjoyable listening to all of the different presentations from the different regions. So yeah, I'm presenting as a PhD student or as a PhD candidate. So I won't take too long presenting because this is my proposal, and I would really appreciate your comments and feedback to make the proposed study even stronger, especially from a methodological perspective, given that that's the conference aim, but also just from all of the expertise in the room, I think that would also be really helpful. So yeah, thank you. So as you can see, my title is Street Vending as Resistance, Women's Informal Labor in Dar es Salaam from 1950 to 1975. So as has been shown by Dr. Nyanto, but also from the different presentations, as much as we lament about how there's been a kind of underrepresentation about women's histories and women's labor histories, I think it would be a total disservice to claim that there's no written history on women's labor in Tanzania. But I think it is fair to say that there's not been enough written on women's labor history in Tanzania, especially in comparison to men, but also in terms of labor history in general. The labor that women performed and continue to perform has been left out of the definition of what labor is. A study on colonial French West Africa showed that the kind of tasks that women most often did were outside the law's conception of work. And this is something that I found is even related to Tanzania, both in the colonial period, but in the post-colonial period as well. And as a result, I'm seeking through this PhD project to investigate the history of women and their labor in the urban setting as an attempt to address this scholarly lacuna. And I'm looking to explore how women's labor was also both appropriated and ignored by the colonial state at the same time. So these dual processes of ignoring as well as appropriating. The socio-profession that the study aims to focus on is street vendors or street hawkers. So women that cook on the side of the road. In Tanzania, we call them mamantilie or mamalishe, as well as women that may sell small bundles of vegetables or small products, small commodities. As well as looking at the socio-profession and the labor and urban history of this work, the study is also concerned with the reconstruction, but also deconstruction of the past when the archive is not enough. And this is something that I know the project is looking at, and is something that I would appreciate hearing more about your thoughts on. But my kind of methodology is to look, or proposed methodology is to look at other sources such as museums, oral traditions, songs, photography, myths, and hearsay. And in the end, the study proposes to look at the different ranges of labor professions under the umbrella of street vending performed by women, and how there's this kind of difference in what is considered legitimate and illegitimate. And based on these demarcations, I'm interested in looking at how the archive has kind of typified this labor, how it's documented certain types of labor, but also failed to recognize other types of labor. So the overall aim really is to bring women's labor to the forefront of a historical study and perform a conscious act of recognition of this marginalized past. And I seek to acknowledge and assess women's work while also contributing to decolonial, feminist, and materialist approaches to producing historical knowledge in Tanzania. Because archives form such a critical component of the project. I'm looking to investigate how archives, as well as other heritage institutions official institutions of remembrance, act as inadequate sources of women's labor history, and therefore I seek to explore these institutions in depth. I think the work will propose that these institutions can function not as reservoirs of complete knowledge, but through the silences in the records, we are able to get an indication of the empty spaces that one may be inclined to pursue in order to gain more information about the past. And therefore, the work seeks to challenge the assumption that archives are houses for reliable data and official statistics. And it also seeks to problematize the primacy of numbers and the so-called objectivity of these numbers in making conclusions, which I think is a kind of critical aspect of methodology in terms of doing labor history. But I'm also interested in looking at and challenging archives as spaces of nationalist creations and narratives of domination and colonial success, which is the context of archives, at least in Tanzania, with its colonial past. The work is a kind of continuation of a methodology that I pursued during my master's program, where I used the museum and its records as research methodology in studying the overlooked history of chiefs in Tanzanian history, in conjunction with oral traditions, interviews, and consideration of cultural contexts and oral histories. So the work seeks to interrogate these multiple approaches to doing Tanzanian history and how the adoption of a transdisciplinary approach can yield results and address the injustices of marginalized histories. Tanzanian women's history has been studied by notable scholars such as Susan Geiger, which is really a kind of seminal text for this study. And her approach at looking at urban women's professions was really inspiring to the development of this kind of approach for me, and the way in which she showed how women are hard to find in history. Excuse me. In history, as the professions themselves were intentionally suppressed.
Hello?
Okay, yes, sorry. I just had a bit of a coughing fit. But yes, how the professions were intentionally suppressed, especially by husbands, fathers, and patriarchal societies in early urban towns such as Dar es Salaam. Susan Geiger showed how through professions such as ngoma singers, mamantilia, and other professions that women engaged in political activity and eventually becoming part of TANU. Drawing on Geiger's work, I'm interested in looking at the ways in which women's informal labor can show the resistance and agency of women in urban Tanzania, and the ways in which creative methodologies can uncover these histories. So in this photo, for those that may not know, this is Bibi Titi Muhammad, who was a ngoma singer and later became the first woman in TANU, the Tanganyika African National Union, which brought liberation for Tanzania, or Tanganyika rather. Various scholars, particularly Black feminist scholars in North America, have interrogated women's histories and the obscurity that arises from the archive. This quote by Catherine McKittrick questions the archival process when she asks, how then do we think and write and share as decolonial scholars and foster a commitment to acknowledging violence and undoing its persistent frame rather than simply analytically reprising violence? How do we ethically engage with mathematical and numerical certainties that compile, affirm, and honor bits and pieces of Black death? So McKittrick is committed to using the archive as a methodology to uncover the past, but also to consciously engage with the violence of its nature. And this really kind of speaks to the violence of statistics and the violence of supposed objectivity that I'm interested in avoiding when looking at the labor history of these women. Equally, Saidiya Hartman addresses this approach in her article, Venus in Two Acts, when she categorizes the archive as a death sentence, a tomb, a display of the violated body, an inventory of property, a few lines about a whore's life, and asterisks in the grand narrative of history when engaging with the history of Black female slaves. And so situating this project within this Black feminist tradition, the proposed project will rely on the archive to uncover the history of women's labor in Tanzania, but while also meta-reflecting on the act of doing women's history, the biases of the archive, and perhaps being somewhat dubious of the supposed objectivity of the archive. In terms of African historiography, scholars such as Liam Buckley, Paul S. Landau, and Deborah Caspin have shown how visual archives were constructed by colonial states and used in documenting African history. And I'll also show the photos that you'll see in the rest of the slide. The kind of historical photos have been taken from the British National Archive. So that's just a testament to the use of visual archiving as a way of the colonial state documenting African history. But in Tanzanian historiography, there have also been various studies on women's labor history. Deborah Bryson has argued about African women's labor in relation to the process of proletarianization. Ophelia Mascarenhas and Marjorie Mbilini have conducted a thorough review of the experience of women in Tanzania and Africa, are also listing useful resources for scholars wishing to tackle the topic from the perspective of development, global capitalism, and sociology. So again, an emphasis on these very fixed numbers, statistics, and data. So the work aims to contribute to these approaches with the focus on Tanzanian women's labor history, but also looking at the archive and social historical approaches or microhistory. And I believe that this work contributes to a body of decolonial work that highlights the lives, experiences, and agency of Africans and recenters their stories, but particularly African women. As this conference is about methodologies, and so many of the presentations that we've already listened to have shown the varied ways in which data, statistics, and other approaches can help delve into the history of women and their labor in urban settings. I'm passionate about finding a way to do history where the voices of women are centered, where their experiences are centered, where their stories are represented, perhaps in a language that is not worlds apart from them, with concepts that they may not face in their everyday life, and a way to show their contribution to structures such as global capitalism, the market, the economy, but also not to assume the centrality of these structures and thus restrict the women themselves to the periphery. So I'm interested in hearing about or learning about the ways in which I'm able to do a labor history that may not be governed by such strict labor historical matrices and theories, and how to do labor history that centers social history and the forgotten heritage of the labor of women. So this is an example of a photo from the UK National Archives. And so what does the archive show? In Tanzania, the colonial period was the first time when women's labor was kind of officialized in state records. In German East Africa, the colony was geared toward commodity production for export. The labor of women and children was appropriated by the colonial economy to suit global demands. During harvesting seasons for commodities such as coffee, cotton, and tobacco, women were recruited as migrant workers or employed locally. The need for women's labor was described as urgent, despite their role as workers being ignored during off-peak seasons. So they were only really called in during times of crisis. And women's participation in the colonial economy was also forced, either by circumstance or physical violence. But also in terms of the pre-colonial period, we also learned that societies such as chiefdoms in the pre-colonial era separated labor between gender. The colonial period disrupted this system and as a result affected the ways in which women worked. The archive during the British period in Tanzania offers a more detailed source of women's labor and the official state relationship to this labor. A preliminary survey of archival material from the British Labour Office in Tanganyika shows that in some cases, such as tea estates, the British Colonial Office employed children to perform labor. The argument for this was cited as adult women are not available in the district owing to domestic duties in their own homes. It is rare to see women working on this estate. They are never employed in the factory. So as was the case during the German colonial period, women oscillated between being essential workers to working on the periphery of formalized work. Domestic duties were classified as the sphere of women's labor, despite it not being treated as an area where the government introduced rights, regulations, or remuneration. The British colonial state, however, used the skills that women gained from domestic work to support other industries such as health. Again, another preliminary review of the archive shows how in 1954, at a conference of labor commissioners of East Africa, quote, no women were known to be employed on building construction or road maintenance, but there was a steady increase in the number entering domestic service, particularly as children's nurses, end quote. Despite the later development, 1954 is way into the colonial period. So despite this later development of more so-called formal and acceptable professions, my project is interested in contextualizing how women's labor in the colony and in urban areas was conceptualized as informal domestic duties, but also how women's limited movement and patriarchal structures to labor in the post-World War II era saw the performance of agency, autonomy, and ultimately resistance. As I've said, the profession that I'm interested in with street vending is one that is pretty broad, but that's because the labor itself is broad. From being mamantili or mamalishe, cooking food alongside streets and trade and transport routes for urban inhabitants and commuters within Dar, to selling wares such as vegetables along the roadside. Sorry, the project seeks to delve into the history of this labor and what it has meant for these women. So I'm interested in looking at this labor and how it subverts urban notions of planned space. And this is therefore related to the history of the city of Dar es Salaam. The growth of Dar es Salaam as a cordoned and segregated space under the British colonial state, and the development of women and their labor in the early independence period, and the relationship that they developed to the Tanu state in the early post-colonial period. So the evolution of street vending is also concurrent with the evolution of Dar es Salaam as an urban center. And the resistance is seen in women in these urban settings working to earn a living and using the growing city to exercise their agency. I'm glad that Louise White has come up in the conference a few times because I also am drawing inspiration from her study on women sex workers in colonial Nairobi and the ways in which these women use the growing city to exercise their agency through labor or through the labor that they did. The approach is also somewhat similar to Stacey Langwick and her book, Bodies, Politics, and African Healing, which is on women in Tanzania in colonial and the post-colonial period who worked as traditional birth attendants and healers in rural southern Tanzania, and the ways in which this profession subverted hierarchical hegemonic structures of health and health provisions. Langwick takes the epistemological problem of post-colonial healing as a point of departure, whereas the proposed work of this study will take notions of womanhood and the so-called informal work of street vending as the point of departure. But again, to go back to Susan Geiger, the contribution of women in TANU and the contribution to the independence movement in Tanganyika, I think highlights the aspect of resistance and labor as resistance in a way that the study really aims to delve into. And Geiger looks at these professions and labor as a kind of precursor to women's involvement in politics. But the focus of this project is maybe not to see these professions and labor as a means to describing an end goal of political activity or activist activity, but looking at the quotidian work, the daily work that women did during this period of 1950 to 1975 as resistance itself. So the study will then look at the independence period to see how the TANU government engaged with women's labor and the development of the urban profession of female food hawkers and street vendors during this period. The work will assess TANU's conceptualization of the woman and her role in the construction of national identity and people-centered development agenda. I think this survey will allow for comparative analysis of changes both in the types of work performed by women from the colonial period and the post-colonial period, as well as the ways in which the state, and by extension the state archive, engaged with these types of labor in relation to how the colonial state did. It's here that the work will review if the state changed its relationship to women's labor, which is something that is crucial as the contribution of women's labor to the Tanzanian economy is significant. ILO records show that female employment in agriculture was 87% in 1991, and until 2021 has not dropped below 67. So this is key considering that agriculture has been a key sector for growth, but also shows how women's labor and their relationship to food production, food preparation, selling, informal labor, and the informal economy has been significant and has been pretty dominant in terms of their engagement. So the work will assess the historical roots of the post-colonial state's relationship to women's labor and assume that if the value of women's labor was overlooked in the past, in markets, monetary systems, the household, marriages, then the archive must be no different and the present is influenced by this past. So the work will ask whether notions of coloniality and independence influenced how the labor that these street vendors performed was valued or not. And it will also show the ways in which the archive and other state institutions have engaged with this informal labor. In this sense, I'm interested in different questions. How is labor remembered? How is it memorialized? How do heritage institutions ignore this labor, and why might this be? To a certain extent, museums are not known necessarily to be associated with the documentation of labor history, but it was definitely a colonial focus, at least in the British colonial period. Museums collected different objects and tools associated with particular forms of labor, such as hoes, farming tools, fishing nets, which were collected extensively in the establishment of the King George V Memorial Museum in Dar es Salaam. These tools were commonly associated with male labor roles. So I'm interested in highlighting how labor, even when it is memorialized, is not of women and was most likely memorialized in relation to the so-called formal economy. So as much as the archive may offer insight into through labor reports, statistics and documents from the Labor Office and different government departments, there's also the expectation of extensive gaps in source material. Labor reports often do not refer to the individualities of workers and their experiences, mentalities, and relationships around labor, especially to informal workers such as street vendors. Documents that I've been able to engage with in the archives, just preliminary, range from inspection reports, labor surveys, company case studies, which all focus on production and economic returns rather than the human dimension of the performed work. So the work will reflect on how to access forms of labor that were not logged into official archives. And I've mentioned this before, but this will hopefully be done through oral testimonies, songs, literature, but also importantly, personal testimonies. And this is also a factor for the scope of the work, the time scope of the work for 1950 to 1975, to be able to do interviews and get oral history testimonies from people who may have actually engaged in this labor, who are still alive, or at least people who have memory of this labor. So people that lived in Dar es Salaam in between 1950 and 1975, and their memories of women that performed this labor. So as much as the work will assess the relationship between the state and women's labor, it's also concerned with the experiences of these women and their memories around this labor. The work explores how women characterize what they think is work. Is there a difference between, for the mamantilias and mamalishes that cook, is there a difference between cooking for urban commuters and workers in comparison to cooking at home for the family? And is there a kind of currency around remuneration around this work? If this currency is not money, is it honor? Is it respect? Is it acceptance into society of what it means to be a woman and this association with cooking? The work will also interview and collaboratively engage with women to interrogate the history of this labor and how it changed across historical periods, and the ways in which women's labor patterns were influenced by colonialism and independence, which often take center stage, but also perhaps the ways in which colonialism and independence did not influence this work. In this sense, the work will focus on the agency of women throughout history and the ways in which their subverted labor kind of challenged the state and colonial hierarchies. The work aims to be a conduit for the life stories of these women and allowing their memories, stories, and interpretations to take an active role. Perhaps these women do not see the work that they were doing as overtly political, but just as an act of necessity for income generation. And I think this perspective should and will be acknowledged. To speak a little bit more about the...
Yeah, if you want to have time for questions, it's
Yes.
better up and then come to quickly.
Yes, okay. So I think, yeah, just to wrap up in terms of the scope, I think I'm looking at 1950 to 1975, because this is when the city of Dar es Salaam experienced rapid growth, especially in the post-World War II period. But also this time frame allows me to work with 2 to 3 generations of workers and see changes of political and economic systems, but perhaps also changing attitudes towards women's participation in the labor market. The historicization of these experiences and memories will also be able to perhaps cast light on larger insights into the history of Tanzania, and get more insight into the history of the socialist period in Tanzania. Ethically, I do not aim to speak on behalf of these women or impose grand theories and conclusions on their experiences. And from this, I draw thanks to Elena's suggestion of Saba Mahmoud's book, The Politics of Piety, and the concept of the feminist subject, and how historical actors, women, and movements may not adhere to grand theories. But also Lila Abu Lugod's article, Do Muslim Women Really Need Saving?, also offers useful insights into the ways in which women, and in her case, Muslim women, may be conceptualized and engaged with on an abstract level, but not actually get the agency and stories of the women themselves. So even though I may believe in categories such as African women, resistance, feminist, I think I must allow for the stories of these women to speak for themselves rather than imposing a feminist language presuppositions and theoretical assumptions. Yeah, so I think I should stop there. And yeah, this is just to show that all of these kinds of approaches are the kind of conventional factors that a study may take. But these women and their histories may be outside of all of these things, such as research, history, labor, recognition, archives, and kind of grand changes in society. Yes, so let me stop there so I could get feedback and thoughts and discussion or any questions. Thank you.